Hello, everyone. How's it going? Are you energized? Are you excited? Yeah. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for coming back. I can't really curb my enthusiasm because I'm such a huge fan and groupie of our next speaker. But before I announce her and before I speak about her, I want to thank you all for joining us again and appreciate you. And I want to thank our sponsors, our title sponsors, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Millville Charitable Trust. Please give them a hand. Our patron sponsors, Land Home Financial Services and NeighborWorks America. Thank you. So let me tell you, I've been in this business for a long time, and one of my ever favorite books that I ever read was The Color of Law. Right? So I can't begin to tell you how excited I am to have the opportunity to introduce Ms. Leah Rothstein. Is the co-author of Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation, enacted under the color of law, that describes how local community groups can address the wrongs of segregation. She also writes a regular column to which you can subscribe for free at justaction.substack.com. Leah has worked on public policy and community change from the grassroots to the halls of government. She led research on reforming community corrections policy and practice to be focused on rehabilitation, not punishment. She's been a consultant to nonprofit housing developers, cities and counties, redevelopment agencies, and private firms on community development and affordable housing policy, practice, and finance. Her policy work is informed by her years as a community organizer and labor organizer, working on issues such as housing, environmental justice, workplace safety, and youth leadership. This wonderful woman has social justice, racial justice, and economic justice in her blood. It's in her family. I am so pleased and proud and honored to introduce Ms. Leah Rothstein.
Hello, good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Come on in, there's seats up front. Not scary, I promise. I'm going to be talking for a little while, so you might want to sit down. Okay, so as you might imagine, I'm going to be speaking a bit about segregation, the segregation of our country, how we came to be a segregated society, and what we can do to challenge that segregation and begin to undo it. And I'm going to start taking us back to set some context, because I think it's important to understand how we got here, to understand how we get out of it. So first, I'm going to speak about this concept of de facto segregation. We've all likely heard this term. It's how we as a country have decided to explain to ourselves why we are racially segregated, why every community in all regions of the country segregated by race, in particular the segregation of whites and African Americans, a persistent form of segregation all over the country. And we tell ourselves that that segregation was not caused by laws or policies, but was a form of de facto segregation caused by personal preference, that people like to live around others who look like them, and so we self-sort into same-race neighborhoods. Or it was a result of private actors, maybe bigoted landlords or realtors or mortgage brokers who refuse to sell or rent homes to African Americans and white communities, and that's why we're racially segregated. Many of us look around at our communities, see how separated and segregated we are, and think it's too bad that we're so segregated as a country, but there's nothing we can do about it, because anything that happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. We don't have any agency nor any responsibility to do anything about it when we believe that it's a form of de facto segregation. This explanation, this de facto explanation, is very prevalent in this country. It's risen up to the Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Roberts has written in opinions that because the government had no role to play in creating segregation, it has no role to play in undoing it. So, this is widely held belief that that's how we came to be a segregated country, by accident or private practice or personal preference. So in 2017, my father, Richard Rothstein, wrote The Color of Law, which it sounds like many of you have read or are familiar with. And in that book, he called the de facto segregation idea a myth. He said, sure, there were private actors at play, those landlords, realtors, mortgage brokers, there was some personal preference at play, but what really caused the segregation of our communities was explicit and intentional government policy. And that government policy incentivized the actions of those realtors, landlords, and mortgage brokers, and often explicitly required their actions to ensure that as we created and built out our communities, they were built out on a segregated basis, and then that segregation was maintained and sustained for a long time. What he argued in The Color of Law was that government policy, local, state, and federal governments, took unconstitutional action to create and sustain segregation. They were actions and policies that were in violation of the Constitution, of the 5th and 14th Amendments. And he, in that book, he gave great detail of all of these government policies that created and sustained segregation, that were in violation of the Constitution. And so his call to action in that book was that, hey, look, if we see that our government violated the Constitution, we can see we have an obligation to remedy those violations. When our government breaks its own laws as a country, we have an obligation to fix those violations, not only to reverse them, but then to remedy the ongoing impacts of those violations. He thought that was enough to say, okay, we have this obligation, now get to it. Well, I'll get to, that later. But so far, as a country, we haven't lived up to that obligation to remedy segregation. And I'll give one example from history just to set the context a little bit more. Again, just one of many examples from The Color of Law, but one of the more powerful government policies that created segregated communities comes from the mid-20th century after World War II, when millions of war veterans came home from the war and started families. We had the baby boom. They were met with a housing shortage, not many homes built during the war, nor prior to that in the Great Depression. And so there were all these growing families needing housing, much like today, without the housing supply to meet that demand. So at the time, the federal government decided it wanted to step in and help meet that demand for housing by helping to build suburbs all over the country and move white families out of urban centers into those suburbs. So at the time, we weren't a suburban country, sort of hard to imagine today, but most people lived in urban areas or on farms. People, worked in manufacturing industries that had to be located in urban centers, and so they had to live near where they worked. We didn't have a lot of suburbs. Well, in the mid-20th century, when the federal government wanted to meet this demand for housing, it helped to create suburbs where they didn't already exist. And one famous example of that is Levittown, outside of New York City on Long Island. Many of us have heard of Levittown. It's built by a builder named William Levitt. He built suburbs and subdivisions all over the country. Levittown is one of his more famous ones. He wanted to build 17,000 homes for families who worked in New York City, who couldn't find housing, on Long Island, which was rural at the time. Not a lot of people lived there. He didn't have the capital to build 17,000 homes himself. He couldn't get a bank loan because it seemed rather crazy and speculative to move 17,000 families to a place where people didn't live. The only way he could build Levittown was with a federally backed loan guarantee provided by the Federal Housing Administration. And the FHA would only give Levitt this federal subsidy to build Levittown on the condition that he promised to only sell the homes he built to whites. And he had to promise not only about the initial sale, but he had to put what's called a restrictive covenant on the deed of every home that he built that said that the home could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. So this was not the work of a rogue bureaucrat at the FHA or private actors like William Levitt himself. This was written into the federal manual for the Federal Housing Administration that determined which suburban developments were good candidates for federal subsidy. They had to have these restrictive covenants. They couldn't be built near where African Americans lived. Sometimes they were required to build a wall between the suburban development that the federal government helped to subsidize and a nearby African American community. So this idea that segregation happened without the involvement of government is nonsense. This was explicit, intentional government policy. Now, William Levitt, he wasn't a progressive thinker in terms of race, to say the least. He said at the time he wouldn't have sold his homes to African Americans if he was left to his own devices. But the point is that he wasn't left to his own devices. If we can imagine an alternate history where our federal government lived up to its own constitutional obligation and said, say, William Levitt, you can have this federal subsidy if you promise to sell your homes on a non-discriminatory basis, Levittown would look very different than it does today, and the country would look very different, because Levittown is one example, but suburbs all over the country were built in the same way with the same requirements put on them by the federal government. Today, Levittown's population is 2% African American, and the surrounding area that's 13% Black. And that disparity, even though those restrictive covenants are no longer legally enforceable, and we now have the Fair Housing Act, and you can't discriminate in the sale and rental of housing, that disparity is there because of these past government policies that were in place when those homes were first sold. And here's a little more detail about how that works and why we're still living with the legacies of these policies, even though they're no longer enforced. So when the homes in Levittown first sold, they sold for about $100,000 in today's money. That's a very affordable price for a home in a suburban community. Any family of any race with a worker in the post-war economy could have afforded that home. White families, white veterans could have gotten a no down payment mortgage from the VA. If they weren't veterans, they could get a low down payment mortgage from the FHA. So these homes, they were subsidized on the builder end and the home buyer end by the federal government. Well, those homes in Levittown and suburbs like it all over the country don't cost $100,000 today. Today, the median home price in Levittown is almost $700,000. And in suburbs around the country, they're $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, some places $1 million or more, these homes that started out very affordable. So those white families that were helped to get into home ownership when it was affordable, they accumulated massive wealth through that home ownership experience. And they didn't get into home ownership with the intention of accumulating wealth. They needed a home, but what happened is they did accumulate a lot of wealth. They could use that wealth to send their kids to college, enjoy their own retirements, and most importantly, hand down their wealth, some of that wealth, to their children and grandchildren to buy their own homes. And African Americans were explicitly prohibited from building up wealth in the same way. So as a result, we have a wealth gap between Blacks and whites in this country that is staggering. Average African American household wealth is about 5% of average white household wealth. And there's several reasons for that. There's an income gap that is also an issue we should be concerned about and talking about. But the wealth gap is far larger than the income gap, and it's due to these policies that were in place, enacted by our government, that allowed and helped whites to build up wealth through home ownership and explicitly prohibited African Americans from doing the same. And we're still living with the consequences of that, even though in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act, can no longer discriminate in the sale and rental of housing. Those restrictive covenants are no longer legally enforceable. But the Fair Housing Act only looked to the future. It didn't do anything to address this disparity, this wealth disparity between Blacks and whites that exists because of past government policy. So it's sort of an empty promise to say now anyone can buy these homes when some families, white families, are more likely to have intergenerational wealth to be able to afford those homes than African American families. So if we're truly to redress segregation, we need to address these disparities that exist, and we haven't yet done that. And that's why even though, 50, 60 years since the Fair Housing Act was passed, the racial wealth gap is bigger than it was in 1968 because we haven't affirmatively taken on this wealth gap and these disparities that exist and have been accumulating for decades. So the wealth gap is one of those ongoing consequences of the government policies that created segregation, but it's not the only one. As a result of segregation, we have massive racial disparities, serious social problems that can all be traced back to the segregation of our communities. So a child who grows up in a segregated African American community is more likely to have asthma, more likely to have, they grow up to have higher rates of cardiovascular disease, higher rates of cancer, and shorter life expectancies than children who grow up in white communities, even a mile or so away. And this is because those, when we talk about segregation, we're not just talking about a benign separation of people, where some people live here and some people live here. It also goes hand in hand with the separation and segregation of resources. Some communities, white communities, are more likely to have access to clean air, less likely to be located near industrial land uses and highways and freeways. more likely to have access to healthcare and healthy food and grocery stores and access to jobs and transportation. So the neighborhoods where we live in have a huge impact on our life outcomes, income outcomes, educational outcomes, health outcomes, and how long we live. So not only do we have a constitutional obligation to remedy the harms of segregation because of how it was enacted, but I would argue we also have a moral imperative and responsibility to do something about it, because if we believe that every child in this country should have equal access to long, healthy lives, then we have to address the segregation of our communities. So, The Color of Law was a very well-received book, surprisingly well-received. A lot of people read it. As a result, we have a better understanding of how we came to be a segregated country. I think more people understand that it was government policy that got us here, and that policy can get us out of it. We can more clearly see that the costs and consequences of segregation and the unconstitutional manner in which segregation was created and sustained, and see that we have an obligation to do something about it, but it doesn't mean that we know how to do that, how to live up to that obligation. It feels overwhelming. It feels almost impossible to change. It's just what our country looks like. It's kind of the air we breathe. How can we possibly challenge this and change it in a meaningful way? Well, a lot of people asked my dad after he wrote The Color of Law and gave talks like this around the country, we get it, we should do something, but what do we do? And he wanted to retire after writing that book, but he got that question so many times that he decided he himself had an obligation to try to answer it. So he got me to work with him on the follow-up book, Just Action, to try to answer that question, to give readers and community members across the country ideas of what we can do to begin to challenge segregation. And I will just say that I hesitated to work on this project with him because I also didn't know what we would come up with to fill up a whole book. I worked in housing policy, and I still was sort of adopting this belief that segregation was too hard to take on. But as we researched this book and wrote it, there's so much that we can do, and very little of what we wrote about was original thought to us. It's stuff that's happening already. We just put it all in one place and found that there was more than we could actually fit in a book. So there's actually so much that we can do locally to begin to challenge segregation, and that's why we wrote this book, to try to get everyone to agree with us that there's so much that can be done. We just have to start doing it. So what we argue in Just Action is to start to live up to this obligation to challenge segregation. We need a newly energized, reinvigorated civil rights movement with a grassroots presence around this country. And the civil rights movement has made huge, very important gains in racial equity in this country, is continuing to protect those gains through legal and legislative channels. But what we really need is grassroots movements, local groups organized to advance these policy changes and protect the advances we have made in order to make real progress on segregation. We saw some of this in 2020 when millions of people came out in Black Lives Matter demonstrations. So there's energy and appetite for these kinds of changes out there, even if we've seen some reversal on some of that lately. There is still a lot of energy and appetite for advancing racial equity issues in our communities, and it's about channeling that energy into these tangible policy solutions. So what we wrote about when we wrote this book several years ago, it was true then, I would say it's even more true now, is that to start to challenge segregation, it's important that we start by focusing locally on what we can do in our own communities. The federal government had a huge role to play in creating and sustaining segregation. It will, I hope, eventually have a huge role to play in undoing segregation, but we're not going to get those kinds of advances from the federal government today. We can, though, make some advances in our own local communities. With our own city councils and planning commissions and local elections, we can have a real impact, and a lot of what sustains and maintains segregation is local policy. So there's actually a lot of effective policy change we can impact if we focus locally. So we believe that that's where we need to start. And I know that all of you in this room are active in local housing issues and advancing housing equity. And so I'm speaking to you today in your professional capacities and also in your personal capacities as members of your communities, because we need so much advancement and change and policy innovation to challenge segregation that it's going to take more than what we can do at our desks at work. It takes also how we talk to our neighbors, how we show up at PTA meetings, how we show up at city council meetings, how we vote in local elections, and that's what it will take to build this movement. And on that note, I know, I usually give these talks and I lead with talking about community land trusts as a great example for how to advance efforts to desegregate communities and prevent displacement in gentrifying areas. And I'm not going to do that here because you all know more about community land trusts than I do, and I'm thrilled to be in a room of people who do. So I'm going to be giving a couple of other examples that maybe you know less about, maybe slightly outside of the purview of what you do day in and day out, because I just want to show that there's a lot that we can do and a lot that we should be aware of in our own communities of what can impact segregation and housing equity. So what we argue in Just Action is that to build this local, grassroots civil rights movement to challenge segregation, we need to start by building cross-race relationships and groups that have membership and leadership that is, whites and blacks and other ethnicities and races. And to do that, we need to start by having, social connections, building social capital and trust, and that in itself often feels like a very daunting first step for many people. Many people live in segregated communities. Going about their day-to-day business, they tend to see people who look like them. Outside of the workplace, most people socialize with people of their own races. And so we believe that in order to start this movement, we have to break down those divides and start to get to know each other. It's daunting, not impossible. We give some examples, some really creative examples and some very simple examples in the book of communities that have brought people together from segregated neighborhoods in the same city to just start to get to know each other. And from that, they start campaigns and advocate for changes in their communities. But that's an important first step. And then once these groups are formed, there's dozens and dozens of strategies and policies that they can take on and advocate for that can have a real impact on challenging segregation. And the strategies we describe, they do what the Fair Housing Act did, which is look to the future to ensure that we don't continue to create and sustain segregation going forward. And they also do what the Fair Housing Act did not do, which is address the wrongs of the past and address the disparities that exist today as a result of government-sponsored segregation. We need both of those forward-looking and past-looking strategies to truly make progress on this. And then the strategies that we describe, they fall into a few major categories. The first are what are called place-based strategies. These are strategies concerned with increasing investments and resources in lower-income, segregated, predominantly African-American communities, where the concentration of poverty and the lack of resources and investment is due to the same policies that created its segregation. So to remedy that, we want to increase investments and resources in those areas. We also understand that when that happens in a lower income community, when investments and resources increase, often suddenly people with higher incomes become interested in living there. They drive up the cost of the housing in those communities. The longtime residents of those areas are priced out of their own community just when they start to see an increase in investment. This is gentrification. So these place-based strategies need to be coupled with anti-displacement strategies to prevent some of the displacement that can occur when gentrification happens. So some of these strategies, I'm going to go through some of them quickly, and then in a bit I'll get into a couple in more detail. Again, all of these are locally adopted policies or programs. So renter protections to protect renters from rapidly increasing rents or unjust evictions, which happens a lot in gentrifying communities. Providing a free right to counsel to an attorney to low-income tenants who are facing evictions. Inclusionary zoning policies that require that when new housing is built, a certain percentage of the units have to be affordable to lower moderate income households. Using the Community Reinvestment Act to ensure that banks are equitably investing in all of the neighborhoods in their service areas so that they're providing investments, bank branches, mortgages in lower income communities as well. Creating home ownership opportunities in gentrifying areas, shared equity models, community land trusts to create home ownership opportunities for lower and moderate income households that are permanently affordable and that can prevent displacement in those communities. And assisting homeowners who are facing rapid increases in their property taxes as a result of gentrification. So some communities adopt property tax moratoriums or abatements or deferments for lower income homeowners in gentrifying areas to help them be able to stay in that community as it starts to see more investment. So those are some examples of place-based and anti-displacement strategies. We also need what are called mobility strategies. These are strategies concerned with opening up exclusive, expensive, often predominantly white, often suburban communities to more diverse residents. A lot of ways to do that, and equally as important as place-based strategies. The first one is zoning reform. It's the first step we need to take on to ensure that more housing types, housing sizes, a broader range of affordability options are allowed to be built in suburban communities. We can provide subsidies for families who've historically been excluded from these communities, rental subsidies, homeownership subsidies, and ensure that as we're building new housing to meet the current demand for housing, we're building housing that's truly mixed income. So it has units that are market rate units affordable to low income families, and units affordable to middle income families. That missing middle piece is essential. We can also make sure that as we're building new affordable subsidized housing, we're not just citing that housing in already low income, high poverty communities, but that we're also citing affordable housing in these high opportunity, more expensive communities. And we can also ensure that the Housing Choice Voucher or Section 8 program is a better tool for mobility for low-income families. And there's a lot of ways locally that the Housing Choice Voucher program, how it's administered locally, that can make it a better tool for mobility. And I'll try to get to that if I have time. We also describe strategies that fall under the category of increasing homeownership opportunities and reducing obstacles to homeownership for African Americans in any type of community. Community land trusts, again, down payment assistance, homeownership counseling, reforming the credit scoring system to make it have a less racially disparate impact on how credit scoring works. We can subsidize the construction of homeownership and help create and start and expand shared equity homeownership programs. So that's the overview of many of the strategies we talk about. I'm going to get into detail on a few of the ones I mentioned. The first, very important, getting a lot of attention right now, is zoning. We've all probably heard a lot about zoning debates today. It's an essential piece for meeting the affordable housing crisis that the country finds itself in. It's also essential for addressing the segregation of our communities. Now, a majority of residential land in this country, 75% last time I checked, it might be different now because zoning codes are being changed all over the country, which is great, but 75% of residentially zoned land is zoned only to allow a single family home per lot. And in suburban communities, it's usually over 90% or 100% of the residential land. Now, what's not as well known about the zoning debate is that single family only zoning was born out of racialized zoning. It used to be that cities zoned by race. They had zoning codes that said this area is a white zoned neighborhood and this area is zoned to allow African Americans to live. And at some point the Supreme Court said cities could no longer zone by race. And so a lot of cities, because they could no longer do that, they took the white zoned areas and made them single family only zoned. That meant that you could only build one home per lot. It usually also made it a minimum lot size, so the lots were very big. So what that did was that as demand increased for housing in those communities, you couldn't build more housing than there were lots, so the prices just go up. Those houses remain expensive and keep getting more and more expensive. This is what we're seeing today, because you can't build more homes to meet demand. So by keeping those areas expensive, it made them exclusive. That's why it's called exclusionary zoning. It keeps out any but the most affluent families, any families that don't have intergenerational wealth to be able to buy a home, can't afford to buy homes in those communities because there aren't enough homes to meet the demand. So to meet demand for housing today across the board, and also to desegregate those areas, we need to change our zoning codes to allow, now it doesn't have to be changing from single family only zoning to huge apartment buildings. There's a lot that we can do in between. We can rezone to allow denser multifamily housing near transit stops, near commercial corridors. We can rezone single family only lots to allow duplexes or triplexes or accessory dwelling units on a single family lot. These are all sort of smaller, more incremental changes that can provide a broader range of housing sizes and affordabilities in all kinds of communities. And I mentioned earlier the missing middle. This is, a large portion of the population falls into the missing middle category. Most African Americans are middle income, make too much to qualify for low income housing and too little to afford market rate housing. So if we're looking to desegregate suburban communities, we have to ensure that we're building this missing middle housing that's affordable to middle income households. And the first step to be able to do that is to allow builders to build smaller houses, and duplexes and triplexes, cottages, cottage clusters, ADUs, to provide housing for the missing middle. Now, I know that this isn't an easy task. Rezoning efforts, proposals for multifamily housing or affordable housing are often met by very intense opposition. I'm sure we've all experienced this in our communities and our work on housing. The opposition is so intense and so successful that they have their own name, that we've given them NIMBYs, not in my backyard. People who say that they support housing goals generally until something is proposed in their neighborhood, and then they vehemently oppose it. And they've been very successful at opposing housing developments, at opposing rezoning efforts. They're very vocal. Now, I believe that they're very successful because they're very motivated. They feel personally impacted. They're afraid of the impact it will have on their own community, their own block, the property values of their own home. That is a very strong motivation to turn out to city council meetings, planning commission meetings, and voting to block any kind of change in community character. Now, I believe that there's just as much support as there is opposition to these kinds of changes, but the supporters are less personally motivated. If you're not motivated by fear, but you're just, you'd like to see a more diverse community, that might not be enough motivation to turn you out to a city council meeting. But we can find those supporters and turn them out and really build up a group of supporters in our own communities that understand that allowing a more diverse housing type creates the kind of communities that we want to live in, and have that group become more vocal and give the elected officials in our communities, many of them who want to support these kinds of changes but need to hear from their constituents that there's support out there. And once we start turning up and turning out those supporters, we can start to see changes and actually start to challenge the NIMBY opposition and have some success. And I've written about some of these. I don't have time to get into the story, but a great story from Silicon Valley, very, very expensive community, where a group started to learn about the history of segregation in their community and learned that the NIMBY opposition to building new affordable housing in their community was just another step on this long history of exclusionary policies. And so they organized to go door to door to defeat a ballot initiative that was put on the ballot by folks who didn't want to see 90 units of teacher housing being built in their neighborhood. They went door to door every weekend talking to voters, and they ended up defeating the measure because they found that there was more support in their Silicon Valley, very expensive, exclusive community, more support for affordable housing than there was opposition. They just had to get out there and talk to people about it. So it's doable. Daunting, maybe, difficult. I'm not saying it's easy, but doable. And important, essential if we're trying to advance these goals. One other strategy I wanted to get into more detail with, and bear with me, it's a little bit wonky and detail-oriented, but I talked about how we need strategies to reduce the obstacles to home ownership for African Americans, to address the wealth disparity, the wealth gap. We need down payment assistance programs. We need to be able to make home ownership more attainable. We also need to address the ways that home ownership is not as good of a wealth-building tool for African American homeowners as it is for whites. So we can't just think that we're done. If we're interested in closing the wealth gap, we're not done by just handing over the keys and getting folks into home ownership opportunities. There's a lot of ways that the home ownership experience is not the same for different races. So there's things like bias in the appraisal system, discrimination in mortgage and credit underwriting, lack of estate plans in Black communities where then homes aren't passed down from generation to generation as the previous homeowner, the original homeowner wished. So the wealth isn't retained in the family. There's heirs property laws that makes it easy to get properties out of families' inheritance sort of line into investors' hands. And those can be reformed in our communities, in our states, to ensure that the wealth in home ownership is actually retained in families. Now, there's another piece of this system that you hear less about, maybe a little bit more these days, I'm not sure. I'm in it, so I hear about it a lot. But this has to do with the property tax assessment system. So we think of property taxes, again, racially neutral, a fair assessment. You know, everybody pays property taxes, every homeowner pays property taxes, and you know, that we assume it's fair. It's all run by county tax assessors, so again, a local issue. But in reality, African Americans are overpaying in property taxes relative to whites in communities all over the country. Not because the system itself has a racially discriminatory motivation, but it has a racially discriminatory impact. And here's why. So when you pay property taxes, your jurisdiction, your county has a property tax rate, X percent, say 4%, I don't know, 1%. Everybody in the jurisdiction pays that percentage of their home's value, their assessed value, and that's why property tax bills are different, because home values are different, not because the tax rate is different. So the tax rate remains the same, home values change. And the tax rate should be applied to the true value of your home, as close to the market value as possible. But you can't know the true market value of a home unless it's sold. So a county tax assessor has to make an assessment to decide what they think the value of your home is. Now, many county tax assessors don't do very accurate assessments to begin with, and then many don't do reassessments very often or almost ever. In researching this book, we found communities that hadn't done a true reassessment in 20, 30, 40, or 50 years. So in that time, they take the base assessment from the last time they did a true assessment of all of the property values in the county, and then every year they adjust it by some percentage. They say, this year we think the housing market's doing well, we're gonna adjust all of the assessments by 1% up. This year now we think the housing market's a little slow, so we're adjusting all of the assessments down 0.5%. So all of the assessed values go up or down at the same rate in a jurisdiction. But that's not how true property values work. In more expensive white communities, true market values grow a lot faster than those fixed rates of adjusting the assessed values. And in African American communities, the true market values stay the same or sometimes decrease in that time. So while everybody's assessed value is going up and down at the same rate, white homeowners' actual market values of their homes are a lot higher than their assessed value for their property taxes, so they're underpaying in property taxes. African American homeowners' true market value of their homes are often under the assessed value of their home for property taxes, so they're overpaying in property taxes. Now, when you're overpaying in property taxes, you can build less wealth through home ownership because more of your wealth is going out to pay property taxes. Now, everybody should pay property taxes, but it should be assessed on a fair and accurate basis so that we're all paying the right amount and not overpaying because the assessment process is not working as it should. So on average around the country, black homeowners are paying 10 to 13% more in property taxes than white homeowners when you keep the values of their homes constant. So this is something that not a lot of people know about. Many homeowners, they just pay their property tax. It might seem off, but you don't look at other people's property tax bills to know if yours is, makes sense compared to someone else down the street or across town. So this is another thing local groups working in housing issues or housing equity issues can take note of and start to look at property tax bills and start to understand if the assessed values are actually making sense and start to do some research and understand where those disparities exist and what can be done about it. We can start to collect data on this. There's also data depositories out there. The University of Chicago has a property tax project. You can look up your county and see what the disparities are there. Philadelphia's mayor has started a task force to look at property tax disparities. So there's starting to be some movement on this. And there's a lot that we can do to bring this to the attention of other residents in our communities and elected officials in our communities to start to make adjustments to the assessment process to ensure accuracy and fairness. We can also help homeowners who think that they're being overassessed to appeal their property tax assessments. And eventually, I think as we build up more power in our local community movements, we can start to demand that those Black homeowners who've been overpaying in property taxes for years deserve a repayment or a refund for that overpayment. So there's a lot that we can do around this issue if we're interested in advancing equity in the home ownership experience. So time goes really fast when I'm up here talking, and I had other examples I wanted to get to, but I am going to wrap up, and I hope that because you can see my desire to want to keep talking to you about all of the things that we can do, that you understand that there is so much that we can do. Creating segregation, maintaining it, took a lot of smaller, incremental policies, actors, activities, programs, and it's going to take just as many to undo it and challenge it. A lot of people want to see, what is the silver bullet? What's the one thing we can do that will actually fix this? And I would answer that the one thing is anything. We just have to start working on this and start addressing the segregation in our own communities with any of these strategies, and that's how we'll begin to challenge it and undo it. So we just need to get started. And I know you all are here because that's what you're doing. So I appreciate you listening. And Hala's going to come back up. We're going to have a little conversation and time for some questions from you all, but thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Leah. Great presentation. We have so many questions for you.
Great.
I feel like Oprah up here, but without a lot of money. So, Leah, here's the first question for you. Wait, let me think for a minute. Changing minds. One of my favorite quotes in your book, changing minds is not enough, action is more. Talk to us about how imperative this quote is today, and what would that action be?
Yeah, we wrote that in the book, Changing Minds. Now I don't remember the quote. Is important, but action is more important. That's the gist. There's been a lot of attention over the last several years of, looking at our own internal biases. I think that that's important. It's important to understand how we got here, but all of that sort of thinking about these issues isn't going to change anything. These are structural issues that need structural changes. And so the thinking about racial equity is essential because it gets us to action, but the action is what's actually going to change anything. And that action can be, how you talk to your neighbors when a proposal is on the table for a housing development down the street and people are starting to chat about it in the neighborhood groups, how you show up how you vote in local elections, how you show up at your PTA meetings, what school you send your kids to, how you talk to your realtor about homes you're interested in, or there's so much we can do sort of in how we interact with our own experiences in our communities and with housing in our own lives. And then again, so much more we can do collectively to start to change some of the structures that maintain this system in place. And that's what's really going to have an impact. And then once those structures change, more minds then are changed as the structures begin to unravel.
Absolutely. Thank you. How do shared equity and community land trusts play a role in Just Action, the book and beyond?
Yeah, we have a good section on community land trusts, and we talk about the Durham Community Land Trustees, which I know they're here, but that was the example that we gave in the book. So every strategy example in the book that we talk about sort of on a policy level, we then give an example of a community that successfully implemented that. So the Durham Community Land Trust was the example for that section. I love talking about community land trusts when I give talks like this because so many people don't understand the model, don't know how it works and how effective of a tool it can be to address segregation, to address gentrification and displacement, to address the need for affordable home ownership opportunities for African American households. And the permanent affordability piece of it is the most exciting, I think, piece that most people haven't heard affordable housing solutions that are permanent, that don't need a new subsidy every time, especially for home ownership. So I have to say, I'm doing my work out there in the country to get more people to support all of you and to start more community land trusts. And people are really excited to hear about it and really excited to learn about that model and start to try to figure out how to start one in their own communities. So I hope there will be more.
Well, we really appreciate your voice in raising the awareness about the CLT and shared equity in general. We really do. And just before I move on to the next question, join us if you have a question at Slido and you have the number. If you have any questions, please go ahead and start putting them in. So the next question is, what is next for you? You have this amazing book with all these ideas and suggestions for all of us. What's next? What would you like to see happen? What's piquing your interest right now? What are you working on?
Yeah, I've been, speaking about this book for the last couple of years, and will continue to do that as long as people want to listen to me. And I'm not quite sure what's next. Open to ideas. I would like to continue working on all of these strategies and actually implementing them, helping them get some foothold in communities around the country. I will say one thing personally that I'm interested in is I live in sort of a unofficial co-housing situation, sort of a compound, and I'm really interested in the models out there that are starting to look at addressing affordable housing needs, addressing the lack of housing availability, rezoning efforts, and combining that with ways to live more communally. I think that for me personally, the isolation in single-family housing living is, I think, not great. I'd like to live more communally and collectively, and there's some interesting models out there to start to sort of combine the rezoning efforts and financing out there for building housing with living more sort of collectively, and I think that's interesting to me personally.
Awesome. So we have some questions from the audience. I want to pick a couple. Do we have time, Leah?
We do.
I think we do, right?
I have time.
I do
you all
too.
Have time?
So let's see. Any advice for a nonprofit organization in community development interested in starting a CLT in a disadvantaged neighborhood?
I would say I'm probably not the expert in this room answering that question, but I'm sure someone here is. I think it's, many of these strategies that we talk about start by people talking to each other, making connections in that neighborhood, starting with one property and seeing how you can get that going, recruiting people to be on the board from the community and starting to understand what the needs are in the community in terms of, what need the land trust can fill.
Absolutely. Tell me how you feel about this question. How can you reconcile goals of anti-displacement and community diversification? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a complicated one. As we increase investments in communities, in lower income communities, more white people start to want to move in, and people with higher incomes, and gentrification happens and displacement happens. The only way to truly prevent that from happening is to not increase investment in those communities, and I don't think that's an acceptable solution. So we have to be okay with some change. And some of the strategies I went through pretty quickly help to prevent some of the displacement that can happen as gentrification occurs. Again, we can't completely prevent all displacement and still have increase in investment and resources in those areas. So we have to be able to balance those. But there are ways to do that, to prevent displacement in gentrifying communities as those communities diversify. I went over it really quickly, but a really important piece of that or strategy for this is right to counsel programs. These are programs often passed and supported by local governments, often in partnership with a local legal aid organization or legal services organization that provides a free attorney to a low-income tenant who's facing an eviction. So in gentrifying communities, often landlords start to see an opportunity to get higher income tenants in, and they'll evict or try to evict their lower income tenants to try to start to make more money off of their units. And often tenants don't have representation in eviction proceedings. Landlords do and tenants don't. And so you can see how the deck is stacked against tenants and they often lose. or they might not even show up. They might not even know how to defend themselves in eviction proceedings. And so having an attorney is really important for those tenants, not only to be able to stay in their homes, but to prevent an eviction from being on their record permanently. And so communities are adopting these programs, and it's a very effective way to prevent some displacement while a community changes. I think the questions have to go in the thing.
So let me just ask her the question that came up on the board right now, and then if we have time, we'll take your question. So there's one question that's really interesting. It's about researching the history of the neighborhood, and how did you go about researching like Levittown and other towns and neighborhoods history?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's a really important sort of beginning step as you're starting to talk to neighbors and form these groups, is understanding how the history of your own particular neighborhood, because that really gets people interested in being involved. There's a lot of different ways to do that. Some folks have started projects to identify restrictive covenants in their cities. We wrote about an effort in Charlottesville, started by a journalist, where he started learning about restrictive covenants and then created a program that was a crowdsourced program where people could log on, they're volunteers, they looked at restrictive covenants and logged them if they had racially restrictive language in them. And so that way they created an inventory of all of the restrictive covenants in their neighborhood, their city, created maps, and then created educational campaigns around that. Identifying those restrictive covenants has been a way that a lot of communities start to work on these issues, because people see that in the deeds of their own homes or a home down the street. When you see it in black and white, you can't say, oh, this segregation in my community happened by accident, or this is just the way it looks just because that's who chooses to live here. When you see in black and white that your home was sold on a restrictive basis for years, then you start to understand, oh, wait, it's not an accident that my community looks the way it does. What else is not an accident? And start to understand what you can do to undo that. So restrictive covenants is a great way to start looking at that. Some cities and groups have these programs or campaigns to identify restrictive covenants. You can also start looking into the zoning of your community or the history of zoning in your community. There's a zoning atlas of communities all across the country that helps you sort of identify zoning. There are a lot of educational sort of materials out there around redlining. Sort of any piece of this is worthy of like starting to dig into. And I would just start that way, by starting to dig into those details.
Awesome. Was there anything else? All righty. So I have a couple of announcements. First of all, I want to thank Leah very much for all the time that she gave us and answering all of our questions and being here with us. She's going to continue to be here. She's going to be outside. If you want to buy a book and have a signature, I have a system for you to follow that Mr. Dave wrote down for me. So I'm going to try to follow the instructions. Book signing, buy the book, line up by the rope line, please. Write your name or the message you want Leah to put in the book on a Post-it. Give your phone to GSN staff if you want to have a picture. Should I repeat that, Dave? Did I say it right? Yeah? All righty. Well, I want to thank Leah again. Appreciate you. And of course, don't forget, come back for the reception tonight, 5:30. Thank you all. Leah, thanks so much for everything.